So, Sarah, thanks so much for doing this with me.
Thank you so much for letting me be here.
I never have guests like twice, so it makes me so happy.
I feel really excited, nervous and excited.
We have such a high curiosity, interest, but like investment in a certain kind of faith that other people are very quick to dismiss. And I wondered if we could talk a little bit about that. Deep inside of us, doesn't God just want to make us happy, healthy, wealthy? Because that's something that you have a lot of experience with. In the hardest of your hearts.
Yeah, I think so. I think, again, you and I have a lot of overlapping, kind of history. Growing up in the prairies, I think formatively makes you. But I think there's this other element too of like just the religious environments that we kind of were pickled in, perhaps, that also had sort of some of those influences. And I know for me, I came up in faith communities that were really heavily influenced by the American prosperity gospel, by the word of faith movements, which of course you have studied. And so I am the anthropological zoo for all of your theories.
I am the object of your great interest.
So, I mean, the 80s and early 90s were pretty wild in terms of the charismatic renewal movements. I think sometimes now looking back on it, maybe the bigger miracle is that we still love Jesus. And it's one of those things where I can look at it and say, with maybe some level of complexity of saying, yeah, there was some really real and beautiful things in the midst of all of that. And it was deeply formative. And in a lot of times it was sincere. I mean, it could be very sincerely wrong, but it was often very sincere. And there was almost this playfulness to it. I think sometimes part of the reason why that was that way in Canada is because so many of us were first generation believers. And so we were almost untethered from a lot of tradition. Like most of our churches in our cities were empty. And so the fact that we were all at the Regina Leisure Center, where church smelled more like chlorine from the pool and sounded more like floor hockey than it did like smells and bells, it gave you a lot of room for things like, speaking in tongues and prayer and even audaciousness and possibility that feels kind of as sweet to me as it does feel complicated at times.
Was that part of your faith, the very big prosperity type hopes for health, wealth, and happiness? Was that really reinforced when you first moved to the States?
Yeah, for sure.
When you moved to the States, you went straight to the hotbed, right? You went to Oral Roberts University.
I was in Tulsa, Oklahoma at Oral Roberts University.
Next to the enormous praying hands.
Yes, absolutely. The prayer tower, the whole scheduled revival every year. The whole thing. Forged in the fires of healing evangelism. Listen, I've got some street cred in this world. But I think there was something really about yearning there and about longing. And I think there was something that a lot of us were attracted to, which was, it's really hard to be a person. And in some ways, I felt like some of the gifts that I had from that movement, it took a while to find them on the other side. But looking back now, all these years later, I have this sense of like, I'm really glad that it gave me such a beautiful view of God. That it gave me this view of God that wasn't angry and punishing and out to get you or wanting to teach you a lesson. That there was this God that was present in my life from the time that I came to faith in elementary school all the way through then, that really did genuinely believe that God loved us.
Yeah.
And that meant something good for you.
Yeah.
And what that means now to me maybe looks very different, but I'm grateful I never had to kind of undo what is it I actually believe about the nature and the character of God.
Yes.
Granted, we did not know how to feel our feelings. We did not know how to be a person. We did not know what to do when you inevitably got sick or life happened and those sorts of things. So, I mean, you find the gaps that kind of can exist within that theology really quickly. The second you become someone who's part of that company of people with unanswered prayers, you run up headlong into the walls that sort of theology creates. But there were some things about it still that I'm glad for.
I think I always remember that being my very favorite thing about interviewing people who spent a really long time like marinating in any very Holy Spirit-y situation, is they felt really loved.
Yeah.
And they felt that there was like, that God cared about every part of their biography.
Yeah.
I always came away with it thinking, how beautiful is it to feel like if you write your memoir, it's really always a story about how insanely loved and attended to
Yeah.
you were. And as somebody who often feels like lonely or scrapping it out, I thought that was a really
Yeah.
a thing I wanted to hold on to.
I think you're right. I think you're right. I think that maybe the necessary shift that many of us have needed to make is realizing that God is not just present in those great winning moments,
Yeah.
right? Because I think that's initially how maybe we thought. We thought that God, because God loved you and God wanted you whole and healthy and prosperous in body, mind, and soul and spirit. So when you weren't, because we didn't come up in a faith that was like, well, that was God. God gave you cancer. God gave you this. God is teaching you a lesson, whatever else. The natural flip side of that coin was, well, then you're the problem. You lack faith. You're like, what are you not getting right? Yeah. Because clearly God is not going to fail you, because there's all this love and there's presence and there's this deep, intimate knowledge of you and your life and that sort of thing. And so then you're left with this, well, I'm the bad thing.
Yes.
I'm the broken thing. And I think that that's one of the invitations maybe we have, is realizing that the love of God isn't dependent on control and on having everything go the way that you wanted it to. And what does it look like to find the presence of God in the deepest, loneliest deserts and wildernesses of what it means to be a person?
Yes. Yeah. You met a Brian.
I did. And I kept it.
You both teamed up in ministry in a way that was really full and like big, wild years, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, Brian and I met when we were really young at Oral Roberts University. And we had all these ideas of what we thought life would kind of look like. We thought he was called to full-time vocational ministry. I was always kind of working more in the corporate world. And yeah, life just kind of has unfolded. So we've been together 25 years now, and it looks completely different. I think some of the biggest things that shock people who have known us our whole lives is that
guess
I'm the
who's
one
in full-time ministry. It's me.
The wrong
Sarah.
one. The wrong one. And Brian's found himself in business for the last, more than 15 years. Wow. And, has really built kind of a very different life than maybe what he would have initially thought. Yeah. And yet it's been really fun to shift from growing up together to now growing older together, which is really lovely.
That's nice.
I think so.
One of the ways that you both grew up together, and then it sounds like you've found a different path together, is really navigating how much the churches you hope to serve were heartbreakers. I wonder if you could tell me a bit about the season of disillusionment that you went through.
Yeah, I think that that's a thing that a lot of us have kind of weathered over the years. And I think especially in the last 10 years, I feel like it's been increasing. I mean, especially walking alongside of folks through the evolving faith community, it is remarkable to me how many times people who are still a part of institutional religion or of a church or an intentional community of any sort have assumptions about why people maybe crash out of those communities. Almost all of them felt left.
Yes.
And there's this sense of like,
you left me.
There is. There's this feeling of alienation or of loss. There's a tremendous amount of grief. I think that that's one of the things that we've experienced. I mean, I remember having this moment in my early 30s of realizing almost every church and almost everyone there has been someone in leadership who has experienced some sort of experience of crashing, whether it was, emotional or it was spiritual or it was relational, usually relational.
Yeah.
And just being like, I don't think we're doing this really well. Like, I think there's something actually in the base code setting of how we're doing this that is like ruining people. And it's not just ruining people in the pews, it's ruining people who are trying to run it and trying to be faithful often. And at the end of the day, I'm just a church lady. Like, I love the local church, and I love it because it's so beautiful when it's beautiful. And I even love it for the mess now. And so I've been holding on no matter kind of what happens. And yet there's no part of me that doesn't understand why people don't. And there's even that part of me that's like, why? Like, why are you doing this? But there's something I find really compelling and beautiful about trying to be faithful together.
Yeah.
And sometimes that looks differently than other times. Sometimes it looks less organized than other times. There's been huge swaths of my life where I've needed to take years away from church.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that there is something compelling about trying to be faithful together and having people alongside of you. I don't think it always has to look like formal church anymore. I don't think it has to look the way that it always did or the way that you've always been taught it had to be. I think there's a lot of different ways we can find belonging and find community and find places to practice being good to one another and practice what we hope for, what we hope is true about the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
I hope so anyway.
You started this community for people who don't always belong in other communities with your gorgeous friend, Rachel Held Evans. I wondered if you could tell me about how that started and who she is.
Yeah, sure. So Rachel was a writer, like myself, and she had written a number of books, and she was a leader that people really trusted, not only in this space, but I think particularly in American evangelicalism and a particular experience I think that a lot of folks kind of shared. And her and I were just always friends. We had found each other online. We had very different lived experiences. And yet we just really loved each other. And so we just held on. And so we rode alongside of each other, got up to a lot of mischief, like to give some grief to the Gospel Coalition online every once in a while, chase a few people around. And so, we had a lot of fun, right? And we had this idea of like, well, what if we put together like a weekend for people like us? People who have found themselves in this season of faith shift or questioning or doubting or wondering, does this, I feel like I've lost everything, all the answers I used to have, and now I'm not really sure what even that means on the other side of this. And we thought we would just like to put together a weekend together, kind of almost more as a retreat. And we had this moment like really early when we started putting it together. And I was like, I just don't think anybody's going to come. It's just going to be you and me and Jim, Jim Chapey was our booking agent, and he was helping us with the operations and logistics. And I was like, it's going to be the three of us just kind of sitting in the room. And she was like, don't be silly. There'll be at least 200 people there, or 500 people there, and we'll be fine. And I was like, 500 people? Like, that's a revival for me right in Canada. And so we just had we had 1,500 people show up.
Wow.
In a space meant for 900. I remember us looking at each other backstage a lot with this mix of excitement and joy, but also terror. Because we were I think we severely underestimated the hunger that people had for these conversations. We really underestimated the longing that people had for community, but also for the conversations we were hosting around a lot of these issues that people felt like they were the only ones who cared or who were noticing, whether it was around issues around justice, around decolonization, around purity culture, around how you read the Bible, around how you show up in community. Science, right, was a really big aspect of all of that as well. And so, those sorts of conversations. And so we came home from that first weekend and we just kind of were like, well, I think we should start a thing. And of course, neither one of us really had a clue how to do that. I still don't. And we built out this whole 3 to 5 year plan together that it turned into what Evolving Faith is now, of conference and podcast. And there's a huge online community of thousands of people who walk through life together. We really wanted to emphasize spiritual formation and care for people, as opposed to just shoveling more content and resources or offering a hot take on every single thing that came across the desk. We were really wanting to shepherd and care for people. And that following spring, Rachel got sick and died very unexpectedly. It was 5 years ago now. And we kept going. Jeff Chu came alongside. He was a really close friend of Rachel's. And I think one of the last great gifts that Rachel gave me was my friendship with Jeff. So we led it together for a number of years. He stepped away a couple years ago. And it's been really beautiful to be a part of. One thing that I remember talking with Rachel's widower, Dan, about a lot was how much she would have hated if we had turned Evolving Faith into like a shrine for her. Like she just would have been the very first person in line to be like, well, that's crap. You know? The amount of times I can hear her yelling at me in my brain still to this day. And yet I feel like we've honored her really well in that space. And it still feels a lot like her to me. And it's been a really lovely place to channel some of that grief as well. And I think too, you know, it's meant that we have a lot of shared understanding. People really loved Rachel.
Yes.
And there were a lot of us who grieved really, really hard when we lost her. And people would come up to me and say, I don't even know why I'm crying so hard. I never met her, or her work meant a lot to me. And it's just like, I don't know when we decided whose grief gets to count. Like it's still, that mattered a lot to me. And I think it was also lumped in with a lot of grief people had about their politics and their churches and their communities and their families of origin and the amount of loss that so many people have experienced. So walking through that together and holding on to one another and learning how to lament well together and not paper over it with all the spiritual bypassing garbage like you and I have talked about so much, meant that it became a really sacred space.
There's a history that hasn't been written about like how evangelicals and then ex-evangelicals even began to be called ex-evangelicals.
Yeah.
Because you were like right in the thick of this, of people who like had been given a fully formed, pretty overwhelming subculture and then still wanted to stay faithful, but there wasn't a new thing yet.
No, there wasn't. And there wasn't a whole lot of us who were talking about it really publicly.
Yeah.
Especially 15 years ago, right? Or even 20 years ago when I very first started writing online. And when I very first started writing online 20 years ago, I was still in like the white hot center of my own, what now I would know is deconstruction, but at the time I didn't have language like that.
Yeah.
And it is profoundly lonely, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why Rachel and I decided we wanted to take a run at Evolving Faith, was because we knew that this is a profoundly unshepherded and season of life, but also a really lonely one.
Yeah.
And so just even having other people alongside of you who are able to say, you're right in the right spot. You're not the bad thing. You're not the broken thing, because you're seeing all of these inconsistencies, or you have these doubts, or you have these questions, or even you have critiques, or you have ways where you're going, wait a minute, guys, like the emperor has no clothes kind of thing.
Yeah.
Not from a position of arrogance, but almost from a position of like love and grief.
Totally.
Right? And so being able to be alongside of other people where you feel just a little less alone.
You use such gentle language for people like evolving faith, for example, instead of deconstruction.
Right.
But
for sure. I don't even really use ex-evangelical because I never really felt like I identified fully with the American evangelical movement.
Yeah.
And so even that never felt quite
totally
online. And whereas I think part of the reason why we always really part of the reason why we pulled out the word evolving is Rachel and I had been writers alongside of each other for a lot of years, and we realized like, oh, this is a word that's showing up a lot for us. And we liked it because it implied to us that we got to hang on to the things that we still loved, that we got to have some sort of rootedness in this story that still meant a lot to us. And Rachel used to say that an evolving faith is just a faith that's adapted in order to survive. And there's even this sense of like movement to it and teachability and openness. I just kind of wonder sometimes if some of the panic that I hear from institutional church around people who are experiencing an evolving faith or a faith shift or deconstruction or whatever you want to call it, I genuinely have wondered if they're missing that this is the answer to their prayers and the longings for revival that characterized so much of the 80s and the 90s. And so I think that there was this element of like, maybe this is it. Like there's this real beauty to it. I see such a renewal almost happening in people. And even if the ways that they are pursuing God and the ways that they are pursuing justice or the way that they're seeking to embody what they believe and hope is true about God looks so different than maybe what their elders or their communities have ever known, there's something really compelling and beautiful about it, I think.
So you're like, please don't be, we don't need to be as scared.
No. I think especially now that I'm 20 years kind of into a lot of this work and even into my own experiences with an evolving faith. It wasn't a one and done experience in my early 20s.
Yeah,
that would be nice.
And it was over.
That was it. It's like this is
Yeah.
this is what spiritual formation looks like.
Yeah.
And oftentimes even those seasons of wilderness or longing or silence, they often are altars where we are meeting with God in ways we never expected or anticipated.
Or wanted at all.
At all.
You're totally right, Sarah. I have not thought about that as like these moments of undoing as moments where you're forced to stop and pray. And
I think there's always an invitation for intimacy there
yeah.
with God. I think sometimes one of the worst things we may be being taught during the last generation, well, maybe not the worst thing, but one thing I think that's profoundly unhelpful is the idea of certainty or arrival, right? That somehow you just are done, or that you should believe the same things at 45 that you did at 15, right? And it's like, and if you're not changing and growing and evolving in response to God, but also in response to your life, you're missing it. That's genuinely not the point.
I really like that. I find that so refreshing because otherwise we feel changed as in like just kicked out of things that used to be comforting.
I think so. I did a tremendous amount of deep diving on this. I think mainly originally for my own self. Right? Like, am I broken? Am I bad? Am I losing the thing that has shaped my whole life and that I have loved, which is Jesus? Am I going to lose my community forever? And in some ways, yeah, I did. I did lose communities and I lost a lot of relationships and I lost a lot of things along the way. My story is the same as everybody else's in that regard. But I think the thing that I realized as I was learning and paying more attention to theologians and academics and people, and again, there was this idea of like, well, yeah, you've got all these different stages of development, just like you do for becoming a person, as you do in faith. And I remember, I think it was Dr. James Fowler who talks about like 6 stages of faith. And he talked about how most of our faith communities are set up to function at that stage of literalism. And like, if this, then that. And here's the insiders and here's the outsiders. And doesn't it feel so good to be an insider?
Yeah.
And when you shift out of that stage of faith, which is a very normal thing, all of a sudden you're like, well, how do I fit in this community where I don't feel that way any longer, or I don't look at things and all of a sudden it made a lot more sense. It began to feel less like it was like a pathological problem within me. And more like, no, I think this is just kind of how the community's set up, and that's okay too.
Yeah.
It's for a stage.
Yeah.
It's just not the stage I'm in.
Yeah. Yeah. There are so many people who feel like when they get to that place of uncertainty or doubt or even just really not wanting to go anymore to church, then they feel like there might not be anything left. Like there couldn't be a deeper thing that it's pulling them into.
Right.
And I really like the idea that as we change, that there are different sort of lovely kind of areas of spiritual growth we can still move into.
Absolutely.
And you can see it in other people, that sort of unsurprised at all the shenanigans, reading the news about another megachurch scandal and bad behavior and going, wow, I bet you're about 6 months away from restoring that person back to leadership.
Yeah.
Like that kind of knowingness feels also like wisdom. It's not fun, but it feels like we are
It's hard won.
grown-ups. But then also knowing that like, and maybe this comes to especially because we're also always trying to parent or think about the next generation's faith, is just always trying to figure out like which thing, if I could describe it differently, would I want to hand back to you?
Yeah.
And that is like, that's also that's like a deepening that couldn't have happened with like adolescent Sarah and adolescent Kate.
No, not at all. Yeah. Not at all. I'm amazed by how many things I used to have big opinions about that I don't care about anymore. It's so refreshing. I think that maybe is like part of the this shift. And I've seen this in a number of people, and especially people who are a bit further up the path for me, in a way that really excites me and makes me feel really excited about the next stage of life.
Yeah.
Which is just like, I think when you very first kind of enter the wilderness, or you very first enter that season of, deconstruction, or whatever you want to call it, you're just searching for like the nearest shelter of certainty you can find. Yeah. And so you want to trade your original answers for new and better answers, right? But you've still got the casing of like fundamentalist evangelicalism in whatever it is, right? So you're just like, well, now I'm just going to believe this even harder. And I'm going to create new litmus tests and new purity tests and new ways of knowing who's in and who's out, new black and white rules, right? And I think that's a very normal formative thing. Like I look back on my know-it-all years, which happened to coincide with young motherhood, with like, I'm so glad nobody read anything I wrote for the first 9 years of my career. So glad. Like, it's so helpful.
Did you have a lot of answers?
Oh, so many answers, so many thoughts, so many beliefs, so many things I did really hard for like a month. And so that's part of it, right? Yeah. And so then at a certain point, all of a sudden you're like, well, you can knock yourself out figuring out exactly what theory of atonement you believe in right now.
Yeah.
Or eventually you get to the point where you're like, I can see a lot of different things that are at play here, and I don't really know exactly what 100% it is, but I know it was enough.
Yeah. My parents have this really nice church they're going to, and they've got a pastor who kind of comes in swinging with these really intense sermons, and when he comes in, they kind of go home and sit quietly for a while. And I've never seen them respond to sermons like that. So I'm like, the other day, my dad was like, well, the pastor today was really explaining how we don't actually have, Christians, that is, have a very convincing explanation for the problem of evil. And the whole thing was really about how that's mostly just a blank space that we've put theories into. It was a really smart, kind church. And I was like, I've actually never heard uncertainty preached about that. And I was like, how did it feel? They were like, it was great.
Oh, that's refreshing.
I thought, man, how nice to just move into a season where we're unknowing certain things. Feels really satisfying than pretending to know.
I think sometimes that's maybe the painful part, is all the unlearning part. But at first it feels like a lot of loss. It feels like a lot of stripping away. It feels like losing a lot of your answers or all of your certainties. I remember feeling like I was so sure that everything that I believed was my building this thing on a rock. And it turned out it was all sand in the end. And so what was I left with? Right. Yeah. And so I think that's where you begin to sort of have some of the room for even the possibilities of not having all those answers, of not requiring certainty, of having a lot of room, even for other people's experiences in the midst of all of it. Yeah. But it can take a while for people to get to where your parents were, right? Of saying it felt really good to acknowledge that we don't have everything figured out.
I do find that some kinds of religious certainty is still like, it really gets to me. Like,
oh, it's addictive.
Especially when it's an area I feel like I know a lot about.
Yeah.
And no one is listening to me on this topic.
I have thoughts.
It's hard. It's hard to be.
It is hard.
I'm not loving being compassionate. I'm not feeling very compassionate.
No.
I just feel mostly despairing that the loudest voices in popular religion are
absolutely
the most vitriolic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or they're lying, like 4-step plans. Or it's just lying.
I know.
And that also makes me insane.
I think especially too, once you get a little bit behind the curtain and you realize how much uncertainty actually exists in the people peddling certainty. It's quite a disorienting thing, for sure. I remember really early in my very first kind of rounds of deconstruction being like, I literally cannot call myself a Christian anymore because it doesn't mean the same thing to me anymore. And I think that sometimes our souls need that room, and that's okay too. I remember being really drawn during that season to being like, I think I'm just going to call myself a follower of Jesus. And it's funny to me now looking back years later, because it's like, it's supposed to be the same thing. It's supposed to be, but it felt like a huge difference in my soul of what that actually was, because I had so identified Christianity with particular political, and theological positions and ways of moving through the world that I did not identify with in any way any longer, and fully rejected. And so I was like, great, I'll be a follower of Jesus. This will be what it is. And then I remember having this moment literally in my house being like, well, I should probably figure out what that means. But the whole Christianity part of it, the actual, like, who is Jesus? What is this thing I'm actually following if it's not this? I should probably figure out what that is. And of course, me being me, I'm Protestant and charismatic, so it's going to be like, well, I'll go to the Bible, and it'll be sloppy and experiential and deeply personal. And so all of that got thrown in, during that period. But I think a lot of us kind of do run up against that feeling of like, not this.
Yeah.
I think that's a good starting point. You may not know what it is you want to be for yet, but you've begun to identify not this or what you're against. But I think sometimes part of the problem that we run into when we're experiencing an evolving faith is we stop there. We stop at the against, and we don't keep pushing through to see what the invitation is of what is it that I want to be for? What is it that I want to lean into? What is the thing that I want to practice? What is the thing I want to embody that would be hopeful and good and filled with love in the world, no matter what you name it or call it? I don't want to stop at just being against things. I want to learn and lean into what I want to be for.
Yes.
Which I think gets to some of the stuff we've talked about a lot around that next generation, around raising our children. If I'm not giving them this container for God, and I want to do what Meredith Ann Miller talks about, give them a faith that they don't have to heal from,
Give them a faith they don't have to heal.
That's the bar we're trying to clear right now. And so there's this element of, what do you want to be for? What is it you're dreaming about? What is it you think that God's dreaming about for the world? What do you think it would actually look like? And how do we move into that space of, what do I want to be for? I want to be for love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and even possibly self-control. I want things like justice in the world. I want, goodness, not just for me, but for my neighbors. And so that's a path. Maybe it's not this, but it could be this.
I think one of the things I wanted to keep is, and this is I guess one of the things I learned when I was sick, is I really wanted to keep the experience of Lent, going up to Jesus's death, as being the annual practice. Because we have seasons of ups and downs, and sometimes we're in the really joyful season, but then it's Lent. And then sometimes we're in the really sad season, and then it's Lent. But that way, every year, everyone could practice the kind of belonging that comes from knowing that we're all going to need to be saved. We're all going to need to be carried. And that we needed an example of overwhelming love and the conquering of death. That is one thing that's really stuck.
It is.
In the after times for me. I want that. I'm always like, with me and my son, I'm like, well, Zach, it's people who love God, we're losers by cultural standards. And he's like, what? And I was like,
come sit next to all of us who are despised.
It's going to be great. It's going to be great.
I remember having a moment, I think this is one that I look back on now and recognize it as being a bigger moment than I did at the time. And it was around Ash Wednesday and Lent. I was in a really deep season of grief. We had experienced miscarriage after miscarriage, and our church was falling apart, and I was young, and it just felt like the end of everything. And I remember driving by this Episcopal church in San Antonio for weeks on my way to work. And then one day, on a Wednesday, I saw the church parking lot was packed, and I don't even know why now. I just pulled in. And I went in, and I just felt so out of sorts. I existed in this narrative of sunshine that had to be relentless and never ending, and answers for everything. And all of my answers were ash. And so I pulled in, and they were doing the Ash Wednesday service, and they were doing the full liturgy of ashes to ashes, dust to dust. But they also had so much scripture and so much liturgy around sorrow. and around darkness and around loss and that very thing that you were saying there. And I remember feeling like this dislocated joint in my soul just went back into spot where I was like, oh, I think God's in the dark too. Yeah. I think God's in the grief. I think God's with me when I'm wrapping up what I hoped would be a baby in a tea towel. I think God's with me here. And I think God's with me when I'm really sad about what our pastor did. And I think God's with me when I'm really disappointed in how the Christians around me are voting about immigrants. And I don't think I have to lose Jesus. I think Jesus is right here in this. And that was a huge thing for me, which is kind of a funny thing to look back on and be like, you come from this certainty and this narrative of victory and this sunshiny version of Christianity. And it's like, what helped me hang on to Jesus, what helped me hold on to what I hope is true about the gospel was that. It was finding people like you and holding hands across the thing and being like, God is with us when we are really sad.
And you've done such a good job of like, it's just, I really love hearing you think about, especially about belonging. Like you're the best person I know on belonging. And you've been so good about saying like, do you feel terrible? You still belong.
Yeah.
You feel like you want a little bit more certainty because actually Christianity has beautiful resources on this. You still belong. Like you've been the like grabber, puller, inner person for me and for so many people.
That's lovely. Thank you.
You always having language for the different kinds of feeling kicked out is very satisfying.
It is. It's just nice to feel named, I think, right? I think for all of us anyway. I mean, I think that's probably been one of the best revelations on the other side of deconstruction that has continued to deepen for me. It's just realizing, God, we are so loved. Yeah. And there's just no place you can wander away from God's love. I feel like this is the thing that I know deepest, and sometimes that's hard to articulate, of just like, God's love is just wider and more welcoming and more beautiful and tougher and more inclusive, more gorgeous, more real than I think I ever would have imagined or hoped. And so there's a lot of room. There's just a lot of room. And I think that sometimes our exercises and boundary markers and who's in and who's out and what counts and what doesn't count is cute. It's adorable. It feels like playground games sometimes when it's just like, look at what we are in the midst of.
This has been an absolute joy. I love your brain. I love your heart, but also I just want to be in all the clubs that you make. Thanks, son.